Hi, I'm Becca,
Hi, I'm Aaron. I'm the worship pastor here at One Church.
and we moved to Bellevue in May of 2018.
So, Jesus talks a lot about who our neighbor is and challenges us to redefine who our neighbor is. And I think during the season where we're putting on these celebrations, it's important to think about who we're inviting into our home and challenge ourselves to maybe invite a new neighbor into our home and bring somebody in who we don't know. And us having just moved into this community called Bellevue, we've gotten the opportunity to seek out new neighbors and to seek out who it is that's already here that we can build relationships with, and start to help the community thrive in that.
It's really important for us to get to know other people that are outside of church, outside of family, because we just believe that people are important and we want to be able to invest in people. We can learn from people in various areas, and just that community is really important to have, just to have support through daily lives. So whether that's us supporting other people or people supporting us, depending on what is going on in our life, it makes a big difference in people's lives.
So when we were first looking at the place that we live now, we just decided that we were going to sit down at a local cafe that we were curious about, and we had never been there before. We sat down and we just introduced ourselves to the barista there. Ended up being the owner of the coffee shop, and we found out that he actually knew me from a while back, and so we got reconnected. And through that, we've developed a friendship, and through that, I've actually been able to get involved in some of the events that they put on. And so that's been a good connection that I made just by being willing to introduce myself and start a conversation.
All right, so again, I'm glad you guys are here as we continue our Seat at the Table series. And so just so you guys know, the right answer for the Christmas Eve question is the day after Thanksgiving is when it's allowed to start. If you started before, there's grace there, don't worry. If you wait till after, obviously you've been given that wisdom from God, not anybody else. But no, I'm just kidding. If you listen to it before or after, that's great. But hey, it's the holiday season. Like, we are in the thick of it. It's 4 days till Thanksgiving, and then we're almost at Christmas time. My boys are already counting down till Christmas and things like that. And it's here, and which means we are right in the thick of dealing with lots of people at One Church. So get ready for it. Me and a friend right before service were kind of just talking about that and kind of lamenting, like, this is going to be a stressful time of the year, but this is what we're about to head into. And we're doing this series, Seat at the Table, because of this dynamic that we're going into with the holidays. We're talking about the importance of relationships and how we're designed to be in community. This is how God designed us to work. It's not easy. Let's just be very clear. It's very messy, but it's purposeful, and we need it. We need to have community in our lives. And so what we're looking at is who has a seat at our table in our lives? Who has a place in our lives? Because when you invite someone to have a seat and have a meal with you, you're inviting them into your lives, and they're inviting you into their lives. There's relationship there. There's kinship. There's peace there. There's hospitality there. And so we're using that kind of imagery of inviting people to eat with us as an imagery of inviting people to have a place in our lives. And this is the purpose that we need to live through. And we're looking at how do we thrive in these relationships and not just survive in them, especially through this holiday season. In week one, a couple weeks ago, we talked about in here how we are all the head of the table of our own lives. Like, we are the head of our lives. We're running it even more. Jesus should be the true Lord of our lives, but we are still the head of the table in a way. And so what Jesus set the example of is this: as the head of the table, as the ultimate head of the table, Jesus, he got down and served those around him. And that's what we should be living out too in our own lives. We're not looking to be served. We should be serving others. And then last week, we looked at the dynamic of family, our biological or immediate families, and how they can be crazy, how they can be great, but they can be difficult. We looked at how our spiritual family, us as a church, that can give us more purpose as we go and love and give grace and interact with our biological families every day of our lives, because it's in our spiritual family that Jesus gives us this togetherness, this unity that's based off grace and forgiveness through him, that we can overflow that into other people, especially our family. And today, week 3, as we continue to dig in this series, we're going to talk about the special guests at our table. You know, the people that you invite in purposely, not your family, because you don't get to choose your family necessarily, but the people you choose to say, hey, I'm inviting them into my life. And we heard Aaron and Becca's story a little bit, how they moved to Bellevue a little while ago, and how they are investing in the community they live in by going to different shops, getting to know people, engaging in the things that are taking place in their neighborhood, and they are trying to be a neighbor to the neighbors around them by loving them, by being with them and building relationships with them and inviting people into their home. And I was appreciative of them being willing to share their story. You see, when I got married, I think I've shared this before, as I kind of hit a jackpot. My in-laws are pretty awesome. Like, you don't always get to hear that from people, but my in-laws are awesome. My brother-in-law, Corey, is back there, is looking, going, yeah, I am. Most of my in-laws are awesome. No, I'm just kidding. But no, my in-laws are great. And especially my father-in-law and my mother-in-law, Brian and Patty. They are wonderful, amazing people. And well before I decided to marry Danielle, and she gracefully said yes to marrying me, I got to learn a lot from the Fishers, because I knew them for a long time before Danielle and I ever got married. And something I learned from Brian and Patty was this idea of including and this idea of hospitality. Because what would happen is they would always just open up their home to anybody and everybody. Like, after church on a Sunday, it was always this thing where people would just go to their house because Patty was making some amazing lunch, and their house would be filled with people, teenagers, adults, friends, strangers. Some people came to their house, they had no idea who they were because someone else invited them, and they were like, whatever, welcome, make yourself at home. This is what they did. Part of it is because Patty is an amazing cook. Corey and I have been plotting of how we can get Patty down to one church more often on Sundays, not to come to church, but just simply so she can make us lunch afterwards, because it's that good. Like, we're working on that with her, but it was just this amazing environment. I loved being a part of it. It didn't matter who you were, you had a place in their home. There was food, there was hanging out, there was people that loved you, and they were extremely genuine about it. And it was an amazing thing to witness, an amazing thing to learn. The town they live in Greenville, Pennsylvania, there's a college there. And in that, they'd always have a bunch of foreign exchange students that went to that school. They would invite them over on Sundays to have lunch so they can have like a family dynamic, because their family was far away at that point. This is how they lived, and it was pretty amazing to see that play in each week. There was a time because they were so hospitable, I once planned a New Year's Eve party with all my friends from college at the Fishers, and I planned this without even telling them. Like, it was the next day after it was all set, like, hey, just so you know, I told Danielle and them, like, hey, just so you guys know, a bunch of friends from college are gonna come up on New Year's, we're gonna play football the next day. They're like, whatever, that's fine. It's just who they are. This is part of who they were. Even if Danielle and I were incompatible, I would have had a hard time breaking up with her, because that family is just so awesome. Like, luckily, Danielle and I make a pretty good team, but they're an amazing family that I got to marry into. And they themselves come from a big family. In fact, their family reunions are crazy, because there's lots and lots and lots of people in their families, but they always made space for the people who didn't fit in the dynamic of their family, and they made them feel like family. And a huge reason for that was their faith in Jesus. They just love people like they were called to. Something that's important for us to explore in this, and the reason I tell this story, is it's important to live and do something just like they did. And we have to wrestle with, are we all supposed to live like the Fishers live and just invite people into our lives and invest in them and give them a place? Or do we have to pick and choose who we invest in? Who else gets a seat at our table after maybe our church and after our family? Who else gets a space in our lives? This is something we have to decide, because all of us only have so much bandwidth for relationships. So who do we invite in to have a seat at our table? Sure, part of Jesus, as we're going through this series, part of Jesus means we should serve others. We get that. We should serve others. We shouldn't be looked to be served. This is how Jesus lived. This is what he calls us to do. And we all have family, and we should be always working on that dynamic of our relationships with our family. We don't have a choice for the most part of who's in our family. But what about the people outside that? What about our neighbors and our coworkers and people in that dynamic? People in our community, people who think differently, people who believe differently, people who look different, people who are just maybe don't fit the natural dynamic of our relationships. What is our responsibility to invite people of those dynamics into our lives, especially when it comes to our faith in Jesus? What does Jesus have us do with the neighbors, strangers, and outcasts in our lives? This is what we need to explore today. And Jesus, the reason we're doing this is because Jesus came to rescue and restore all people into a relationship with God, both for now and for eternity. And by all people, Jesus meant all people. He was for all people. And the thing was, in that culture, when he came, this was a big deal because the Jewish, especially the religious leaders in that day, they felt they were God's only chosen ones. That people outside of their faith, there was no place for them at God's table. And Jesus comes and he starts bridging the gaps between all these other people who felt like they had no place in their relationship with God. He starts bridging their relationships back to God through his love, through his grace, through his mercy, and ultimately through his death and resurrection. So Jesus is coming for all people. But in that culture, status and categories were huge, just like they are today. If someone believed something differently, if they lived differently, or had some sort of baggage in their lives from past decisions, it affected them in great ways, especially when it came to their relationship with God. And Jesus started flipping that upside down when it came to who he invited into his life and who he gave space for to explore and discover that God loved them too, and they had a place in a relationship with God. One of the biggest people that Jesus did this with was one of his best friends by the name of Matthew. Matthew was one of the 12 apostles, his inner circle of people he really invested in to continue on his mission after he died, resurrected, and went back to heaven. And we see Matthew's story of him coming to know and follow Jesus in 3 different places in the Bible. We see in the book of Matthew, his own account, the book of Mark, and the book of Luke. And all of them are very similar in telling the story of how Matthew came to know and follow Jesus and what he did after that. But we're going to look, for our purposes today, look at Matthew's story, kind of get a first-hand account of what happened when it came to him meeting and following Jesus. And we're going to be in Matthew 9 today. If you have an app on your phone, feel free to use that. If you have your Bibles, open that up. We'll have it on the screen as well. But we're in Matthew 9, and we pick up Matthew's account of his own life when it comes to Jesus in Matthew 9, verse 9. It says, "As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. 'Follow me,' he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him." Now, this scene that takes place is taking place near the Sea of Galilee, which was a very popular spot for Jesus' ministry and just a very popular spot in that culture. And when I say Sea of Galilee, think like a decent-sized lake. That's kind of more of the vibe the Sea of Galilee has. It's just called the Sea of Galilee. So they're kind of near this big lake, and it's a place where a lot of business, travel, and commerce takes place. And it would have been really a prime spot for a tax collector working for the Roman government to sit at. Because in that space, there's so many people, and they're taking goods across the Sea of Galilee or bringing goods back from the other side. And it's there the Roman government who taxed everything, every sort of food, clothing item, anything like that. They taxed it, so it's similar today pretty much. They could sit there as a tax collector and tax all those things that were coming back and forth in that area. So it's a pretty good spot for a tax collector to be. They're taking taxes from all the goods that are taking place in that area. And Jesus' ministry, though, as it's beginning to blow up at this point, he's attracting a lot of people. And the Sea of Galilee was one of his prime spots to do a lot of teaching. There's environments there where a big crowd can be, and Jesus could kind of teach the masses at that spot near that kind of giant lake. And so it was a big time part for him to do his ministry there. And so Matthew would have known who this Jesus guy was because he's working there, and this Jesus guy's popularity is blowing up, so he would have heard about this Jesus guy. And he tells his story from a third-person perspective, so he's telling it, it's him writing it, but it's Matthew, and he was this tax collector, and Jesus invites him to follow him. Now, on the surface, if someone would just pick up a Bible and just read that verse, they would think probably nothing of it. Okay, Jesus invites this tax collector named Matthew to follow him. He gets up, and he does it. But in the context, actually what took place, this was a huge deal for people to hear. Because tax collectors were absolutely hated by the Jewish people. Like despised, they were disgusting. They actually would say, there are tax collectors and there are sinners. Like sinners are people who are far from God, rebelling against God, but tax collectors are so bad, they have their own category. Because what tax collectors were, they were people that worked for the Roman government. And the Roman Empire, the Roman government, they were the oppressors of the Jewish people. They had high taxes. There was lots of extortion that took place with tax collectors. Essentially what they would say is, say they owed like $20 in taxes. What a tax collector would simply say is, no, you owe $25 in taxes, and if you don't pay it, you have to go to jail. So they get the $25, they give the $20 that they really owe to the Roman government, and they pocket the extra $5. So they would do that over and over and over to people, and this extortion would take place, and so the Jewish people just hated them because they had this power over them and they oppressed them, and so they just despised tax collectors. And Matthew is a tax collector. And not only is he a tax collector, he's a Jewish tax collector, which means he's essentially a traitor to his people. And because he would have became a tax collector working for the Roman government, he would have been outcast from all forms of Jewish life. Matthew, as a Jewish tax collector, had no place in the synagogue to worship God. He had no place in the everyday Jewish life of making sacrifices to God, so he could not live out his Orthodox Jewish life because he was shunned from it because of the lifestyle he chose to live. He had no place in that. And scholars believe that because of this, because of his Jewish background, but becoming a tax collector, he would have been highly opposed to Orthodox Judaism because of how he was treated. He was essentially shunned from his own family, from his own community. And of all of Jesus' apostles, his 12 inner circle, Matthew's probably the least likely to ever be chosen. But Jesus invites him. He invites him to join him. And Matthew must have been familiar with who Jesus was because he's in the same area that Jesus is doing a lot of his ministry. And he's familiar with this Messiah, and there's this hope for the Messiah because he wouldn't have just got up and left his very lucrative job for nobody. See, Matthew is a Jew, and so he had all of these scriptures memorized. He knew the scriptures that was taking place and all the prophecies that God was going to send this rescuer one day. So he had all this stuff, all this knowledge. Even though he wasn't part of the Orthodox Jewish life, he had the knowledge and the hope that there was this Savior one day that was going to come and fix all that was broken. And he hears about this Jesus, he sees this Jesus, and he has this hope that maybe this Jesus is the guy he's been waiting for. And so when Jesus comes up to him and says, hey, you, Matthew, follow me. Matthew he got up, and it just says he got up and followed him. What he would have done, because it would have been a penalty of death if he didn't, he would have settled his accounts with the government, closed up his shop there by the Sea of Galilee, and left that job to follow Jesus. And what's crazy about that, if he would have, as he did that, he was leaving everything behind. You see, most of the other apostles, they had a backup plan if this whole Jesus guy didn't work out for them. A lot of those guys were fishermen, or they had some sort of trade that they were raised in by their father. And so even we see when Jesus died and they weren't really sure what was going to happen, a lot of the apostles went back to being fishermen with their dad and living out that family business. Matthew, he had nothing to go back to. So Matthew is this guy who was completely on the margins of his Jewish society, had no place in it. He was a traitor. Jesus invites him to come and follow him. So Matthew leaves his entire life behind to follow Jesus. It's really amazing. But I think what's even more amazing is what Matthew does directly after that we see in his story. Matthew 9, 10, and 11 says this: while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? So what Matthew does, after he closes up shop, he starts following Jesus, one of the first things he does, he throws a party. Matthew's probably pretty wealthy because of the job he just had, so he probably threw this really nice, expensive dinner party, and he invites Jesus and all of Jesus' disciples with him, and he invites people to fill his party. And who does he invite? He invites his friends. And his friends were not the religious leaders in that day, because the religious leaders completely shunned Matthew. They wanted nothing to do with him because of who he was and what job he had. They were people just like him. They were other sinners and tax collectors based off how the Jews saw those types of people. And what Matthew wants is he wants all the people he knows to experience what he's experiencing because of him knowing Jesus now. He meets this Jesus guy. His hope is being found in this Jesus guy. And he wants all of his friends, all of his community to come with him at his house for this huge dinner party, which was a sign of respect and a sign of placement and of value of their humanity, of their life, by having dinner together. He wants all of them to come and hang out with Jesus. He wants them to know the same hope that now he knows by knowing this Jesus guy. So this dinner party is taking place, and the religious leaders know about it, and they come up and they jump in, and they start kind of causing a fuss about the whole thing. But they don't go right to Jesus about it. They're kind of cowards about it. They go to Jesus' disciples and goes, hey, why is your leader, why is your teacher in there eating with other sinners and tax collectors? Pretty much, why is he eating with the scum of the earth? Why is he eating with the people who have no place in our Jewish way of thinking, in our lives? And they start thinking, why is he doing that? Why is he eating with these people? And this probably even makes the disciples maybe even a little uncomfortable because they know their culture, they know their background, they know this probably wasn't the normal thing to do as Jewish people. Why were they with him? Why was Jesus giving them a seat at the table? But then Jesus jumps in, and he says this. On hearing this, in verses 12 and 13, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. And it's almost like Jesus overhears religious leaders, kind of giving his disciples a hard time, like, hey, why is your teacher eating with them? And like Jesus hears it, and he's like, all right, it's time for a whooping. Like, he's a verbal whooping on all these religious leaders. He's like, rolls up his sleeves, like, let's do this. And he goes out there and he goes right to the religious leaders and he's like, listen, I didn't come for you who are healthy. I know you think you've got it all figured out. You got the law memorized. You're doing all the sacrifices. You are living your perfect religious life down to a T. You've got it figured out, but I didn't come for you. I came for the broken. I came for the sinners. I came for those who felt like they have no place at God's table. I came for those who felt like they had no place to have a relationship with God. I came for them. I didn't come for the healthy. I came for the sick. And Jesus looks at these Pharisees and he goes and tells them, he's like, go and learn what this means, which would have been a crazy insult in that culture, because in that culture, when a religious leader had like a disciple, and the disciple just wasn't getting something that the religious leader was trying to teach them, they would tell, go and learn what this means. Essentially, listen, you're really struggling right now. Leave me, go study this, go practice this, and don't come back to me until you have it figured out. And so Jesus goes to these Pharisees who have it all figured out, remember, and he goes, hey, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. You see, the religious leaders were doing everything perfect. They were going to the temple and the synagogues. They were making their worship happen. They were doing their sacrifices. They knew the law. They were following the rules. But because of that, it made them feel like they were the elite ones. They had it all figured out. So anyone who didn't measure up to them, they had no place with them. They got to pick and choose who had a place at their table, and only the ones who had it figured out like they did, only they had a place at their table. And Jesus is like, go learn what this is. I want mercy. This is who God is. God is a God of mercy. He didn't come for those who were already home. He came for the ones that were lost. He didn't come for those who had it all figured out, but those who had questions and doubts. Jesus was starting a hospital for the sick, not a hotel for the healthy. And that's an important thing to remember of who we are as a church. We are not a hotel for the healthy. We are a hospital for the sick. This is a place for those who don't have it all figured out. And this is what we live out together. He wasn't there for those who already had a seat at the table, but for those who were on the outside thinking they weren't invited. And Jesus says, go learn what that means, because this is what I'm about. Jesus invited everyone to his table, especially those who felt like they had no place. And this shows the heart of God, and any follower of Jesus should have that same heart as we're putting our faith in Jesus. If you're a Christ follower here, you identify as a Christian, the way Jesus lived among and embraced people is not an option for us, but it's absolutely necessary for us when it comes to this faith we live out. If you're not a Christian here, you're still wrestling with this stuff and asking questions, that's great. This isn't necessarily an expectation for you per se, but I would say this is definitely something you should explore. Because when you live a life that gives all people a space in your life, you invite all people to your table, you live out the life that Jesus, and the example that he set. The way that Jesus lived was this radically inclusive, relationally driven life. You see, Jesus had a family, and he hung out with a lot of religious people too. He had the church people, he had the family people, but he also invited everybody else to his table too. People with different faith backgrounds, people with different ethnicities, people with different socioeconomic statuses, people with questionable employment like tax collectors and prostitutes. He invited them into his life. People with different baggage, like failed marriages, habits, and hang-ups that they had. Jesus invited them into his life too. They had a seat at his table. Jesus didn't limit his table. He made his table bigger. and we need to follow that. You see, we all have these natural relationships with our families, and we're building them as we continue to build our lives. And we continue to build our natural relationships as we continue to develop as a church too. As we get to know each other on Sunday mornings, through small groups, as we serve in the community, we're building those relationships. But the question I have for myself, because I'm not exempt from this either, and for all of you, is who are you inviting into your life on a consistent basis outside of that? Who are you hanging out with? Who are you eating meals with? Who are you having conversations with that gives them a seat at your table and helps them know and experience God's love for them? Knowing their names and a little bit about them isn't the goal. It's got to be more than that. We need to take time and give effort to know them and build into them. Why? Because God's heart is for people, for them to be known, for them to be loved, and for them to know that they are known and loved by the God of the universe. God wants us to be able to go and love people, to know them, to make sure they have community, but most importantly, to know that God knows them, that God loves them, and they have a place at his table. Jesus was God with us. The way God showed us that we have a place at his table is Jesus Christ. God's not some faraway God, not some non-caring God, but he's close and he's invested, and we need to live the same way. See, one of the biggest problems the church has is that we have a tendency to pull away from people after we start following Jesus. And what I mean by that is once we become Christians, almost all of our legitimate friendships within a few years are people who are Christians too. You talk to most people who've been following Jesus for a long time, they'll tell you, for the most part, after a few years, most of their relationships became other Christians. Now that may sound good, and there's some beauty to that, don't get me wrong. But the beauty of Matthew's story, when we see him getting invited into this relationship with Jesus, is he brought more people who were far away from God just like him. He brought them to Jesus. And so we need to have this mentality of who are our friends who don't know Jesus either, and how do we invite them into that? Or we become like the Pharisees. We kind of pick and choose who our relationships are with and who has a seat at our table. And we pick and choose them based off maybe if they look like us, if they act like us, if they think like us, or if they believe like us. And if they kind of meet our measurements, those are the people that we invite into our lives. Because it's comfortable. It makes us feel better about ourselves because what they think and do, we think and do the same thing. When's the last time we invited someone who doesn't think like us into our lives, or doesn't look like us, or doesn't believe like us? See, the Pharisees were all about this closed, exclusive circle. But Jesus was inclusive. All the things that get in the way of this is we get so focused on work and on family and on church sometimes that we don't invest into other people outside of those dynamics. We just focus on the basics and we don't build relationships with anybody else. But Jesus went to people who didn't have a place at the table. And we need to do the same thing. So the question is, who are the people you're investing in? An easy one is, who's your neighbors? Do you know them? And I don't just mean know their names. Do you know them? Know their lives, their stories, their background. Are you giving them a place at your table? Here's something I want to challenge you guys with. Let's bring the neighbor square up. Imagine that center square is your house. Okay, this is where you live, wherever that may be. Now imagine all the squares outside of those are your neighbors. So maybe you live in a community where you can say, yeah, there's a house across the street from you, there's a house to the left of you, to the right of you, diagonally from you, behind you, whatever that may be. Those other 9, or however, 8 houses around you, I can count, I think. Those other 8 houses around you, do you know who they are? Do you know their names? Do you go out of your way to build relationships with them? Can they rely on you if they're ever in a time of need? Can you do that? My challenge for you guys is this. Hopefully you can name all the people who live around you. And if you can't, go learn them this week. Even if it's the awkward, like, hey, I'm your neighbor. We've never met, but I just want to introduce myself. We have to build relationships with the people closest to us, the people who live by us. Write down their names. All the people, coworkers. Who are the coworkers you work with? People that you're with every single day. People that you sometimes spend more time with than your own family, if you think about it. Especially if you have kids. Like you get up in the morning, you get your kids ready, you go to work, they go to daycare or school or something like that. You get home from work, you get dinner, you get homework, you get them ready for bed, and they're in bed. Like you get a few hours with your kids, and you're spending 8 hours or so with people at work. Do you know them? And not just their names, not just what job they do, because you're supposed to know that as coworkers, but do you know them? Do you know their family dynamics? Do you know their backgrounds? Do you know their faith? A friend of mine was telling me yesterday how a coworker of his at Christmas time, a Christmas gift he gives to all of his coworkers is like a tract on how they should come to Jesus. And this guy doesn't even know who like my friend is. He doesn't even take time to invest in it. He's like, hey, Merry Christmas. Do you know the Lord? Which can get really awkward. I can respect the guy's gusto to wanting people to know Jesus, but man, there's an art to it. There's an investment into it. There is an example set by Jesus to be known and to know other people. So who are those coworkers? My challenge for you, especially in this holiday season, because guess what, guys? Guess what's coming? Holiday parties, potlucks. Spend some time getting to know your coworkers more. And who are the friends and maybe the strangers that live around you or you come across that you can say, you know what, I need to talk to them more. I need to invest in them more. I need to invite them into my life. Maybe I invite them over for dinner. Who are those people that you need to invest in? People that God's already put in place in your life that you see consistently. Who are they? Your neighbors, your coworkers, your friends, the strangers. These are people that God has in our lives that we can pour out his love and grace and mercy to. So here's a couple of steps I'm going to encourage us all with to live out. The first is this. Whoever those people are, neighbors, coworkers, friends, take time with them. I know the first thing you're going to say when this idea of investing more in relationships are, because it's the first thing I say, I'm busy. Life is crazy. I don't have time for this. I'm busy. Everybody's busy. I have not met a single person once I turned once I got out of college, I never met a single person my age or older who said, oh yeah, I'm not busy. I got plenty of time in life. We're all busy. But we make things happen if they're important to us. If loving people, loving our neighbor like Jesus calls us to is important to us, we'll make time for it. We'll change things up to pour into them so they can know, hopefully, the grace and love of Jesus. So take time with them. And here's another reminder. They're people, not projects. There's giggles because we know exactly what I'm talking about. The people we invest in, the people we pour into, they are people, not projects. They are beautiful, loved, created people that were created by God. God knows them. God loves them. God wants to spend eternity with them. Our responsibility in this is not to treat them like some sort of project where it's like, hey, do you know Jesus? Cool, already do. Okay, never mind, I don't have time for you. You don't know Jesus? Hey, do you know you're a sinner and you have this penalty of hell if you don't come back to Christ? Like, okay, you're good now? Sweet, you're in. Check it off the list. Next person, who's next? Like, we don't treat people like a project, we treat them like people, which means we love them, we treat them with investment, we treat them like they are humans, like they are. When Matthew started following Jesus, he had no idea really who Jesus was just yet. They didn't stop Jesus from investing in him. He poured into him. Even before Matthew believed. They're people, not projects. Our goal isn't to win them to Jesus. That's God's job to convict them of that. Our goal is to love them to Jesus. And if we can remember that, if we can live that out, then things are going to go a lot better when it comes to our relationships as Christians. We can't do that, though, if we're not with them. We can't do that if we don't invest in our relationships with them. We can't do that if the thing that is important to God, like spending time with people, is not important in our own lives ourselves. We have to be with them. Jesus, when he was being questioned on what's the most important rule to follow in life, he said there were two. To love God with everything you have, your heart, soul, your mind, and your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. He says everything else hangs on those two things: love God, love people. But there was this person in the crowd when he said that was kind of thinking, okay, all right, who's my neighbor then? Who's my neighbor? This person was undoubtedly looking to pick and choose who his neighbor was so he can pick and choose who to love and invest in. And Jesus tells him and teaches him and tells him a story that, listen, essentially this: your neighbor is everyone you ever come across. whether they look like you, whether they think like you, whether they believe like you. They're a human, they're your neighbor. And you're called to love them like you're supposed to love yourself. We invite all of them in. The one thing we want to walk away with today in that in mind is this, is Jesus leads us to invite everyone to have a seat at the table. You see, the Pharisees were all about less. They would pick and choose who had a place in their lives. They would think, you're not good enough, or you're not good enough, you're not religious enough, but you fit what we're looking for, cool, you're in the club. Jesus made room for more. He invited Matthew in. Matthew's other sinner and tax collector friends were invited in. He made room for more. A couple weeks ago, Robert Bowers decided to go into Tree of Life Synagogue in Squirrel Hill and open fire on the people that were there worshiping that day. In the process, 11 people lost their lives, all because he was broken and messed up and he hated Jewish people. He was injured in that situation and was taken to a hospital. And what's crazy is a couple of friends of mine sent me some articles over the past couple of weeks kind of following up with this horrible thing that happened in our city. One article said as they have been investigating his life, finding out his background and finding out his story and why he would do what he did, they said the thing that drove him to do that day wasn't necessarily his anti-Semitism. It was a man who had failed in so many spots in life. He was a high school dropout. He was a failed truck driver. He had no family. He had no friends. He had no place in his community. He was alone. And so he went looking for community, and he found it online. And if you've been online lately, like Facebook or anything like that, it's pretty easy to find some hatred, some racism, some bigotry, all those different things. It's pretty easy. And those things just fed him and fueled him. And that became his community. And that led him to have this messed up, broken belief that led him to take the lives of other people that didn't deserve to have their lives lost. He had nobody. So he's taken to the hospital. Another article was sent to me. And I'm reading that one that talked about with the FBI and everyone's finding out about him. And I read this other article as he gets there. And one of the first people to treat this guy as he's in there yelling anti-Semitic remarks are Jewish doctors and Jewish nurses. Come on, man. God's got a sense of humor in that, right? But they start treating him. And the head of that hospital, Dr. Cohen, he comes up to him, a guy who just literally was killing his own people. He didn't go in with hatred as he was looking at this guy. He wanted to know more. Like why this guy would do that. And this doctor goes and starts talking to him. And he even said in an interview, when I saw this guy and I talked to him, I wasn't looking at the face of evil. I was looking at someone that was lost and broken. I was looking at someone who was once a child and was raised by parents who loved him, and his parents and the people around him had all the hope in the world for him. And somehow he got lost along the way because he had nobody else. He missed it. What was crazy is in the interview of the article that was sent to me, Dr. Cohen openly admitted that he was not a very religious person. And that's not his thing. He has Jewish background, that's his ethnicity, but religion is not really his thing. But this moment led him to go open up the Bible, to try to make some sense of this messiness, this craziness that we have in our world. And what he saw was, as there's evil, there's also this need for good. And that's what God's working on. His ultimate act of that was in Jesus, by opening up the table for all of us. And we're called to live the same. So the question I want us to leave with is this. Can one church be a church for all people? Do we have more room for more people at our seats at our table? The answer is yes. But for it to happen, we have to live it out together as a church. When we make room for others, for their lives now and their eternities can change through the grace of Jesus. So this week I'm challenging all of us. Make room for more as we go into this season. Spend time with your neighbors and do something for them this holiday season. Do something that shows them love, serves them, cares for them. Reach out to a coworker to get to know them more beyond just a typical work conversation. Reach out to someone around you. Invest in friendships. Invite someone to come with you to one church over the next month. This is a time they're open to it more than ever. Because when we live this out together, we follow Jesus together. And when we follow Jesus together, we become the church that he came to create together. A church that says, no, we have more room. A church that says, there's a place for you at our table. The question is, are we going to trust Jesus and follow him into that? And live out the life that says, no matter who they are, they have a place on our table because Jesus says they do. The reason we can do that is because Jesus said we all have a place at his table in his life, in his death and his resurrection. All of us at one point felt like we had no place with God. But Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection tells us all that we have an invitation to his table. And each week we come to that table through the form of communion. It's here each week as a church that we take the bread, we take the juice to remember that here together we eat and drink at this table together because of Jesus. And that table always has room for more. It has room for me and you. It has room for everybody else. So let's live that out. Let's pray. Father God, thank you so much for today. We thank you for this life that you've given us. We thank you for this church that you're creating. But God, we thank you for the people in our lives that you have given us the opportunity to love, to invest in, to pour into, to give them a place in our lives, and to show them, to tell them that they have a place at your table. So God, help us to live that out. No matter who we come across, God, help us to know they are human, that they are loved by you, and they have a place that we can live that out by loving them. Even the people that think like us, look like us, do things that disgust us, we can say they have a place. Help us to love them in that. I thank you for loving us in our worst place, to tell us we have a place at your table. It's your name we pray. Amen.